This video is brought to you by NordVPN. As you probably already know, over the past year or so, the fighting in Ukraine has been centred around Bakhmut, a town in Donetsk Oblast with a pre-war population of about 70,000. Since capturing Soledar in late March, Russian forces, led by the Wagner group, have been making painstakingly slow progress in the town, using human wave attacks to wear down the Ukrainians. A couple of weeks ago, it looked like the Russians might be about to finally capture the town. They'd pushed the Ukrainians to the westernmost suburbs and cut off most supply lines into the town. However, in the past couple of weeks, Wagner's advance has stalled, prompting a furious row between the Kremlin and Wagner's founder Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's accused the Russian army of withholding ammunition from Wagner. In the past few days, more territory has changed hands. The Russians have made slight gains in Bakhmut itself, while the Ukrainians have retaken territory to the north and south of Bakhmut, causing the war of words between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense to escalate to new heights. Prigozhin has accused the Russian army of abandoning their positions, and even attacked Putin himself in one of his most recent videos. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the changes on the battlefield, the escalating war of words between Prigozhin and not just the Russian Ministry of Defense, but also Putin himself, and what this means for Ukraine. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, to understand the recent Ukrainian advances, you need to understand how the Wagner group has advanced over the past few months. When the Russian army first reached Bakhmut in the middle of last year, there were basically four roads for the Ukrainians in and out of Bakhmut. The T0513 road, which runs north to Seversk, the M03, which runs northwest to Sloviansk, the T0504, which runs southwest to Kostiantynivka, and then on to Kramatorsk, and the O0506, a smaller road which runs west to Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians had good access to all four of these routes until mid-January, when the Wagner group successfully captured Soledar, which allowed them to cut off the T0513 and put pressure on the M03, limiting Ukrainian supplies into Bakhmut. Then, at the end of January, Wagner made further progress around Soledar and took Klishchivka, a tiny settlement just south of Bakhmut. From Klishchivka, the Russians moved west towards Chasiv Yar and Ivanivsky. By mid-February, the Russians had made further progress around Soledar and were then at the outskirts of Ivanivsky. This essentially meant that 3 out of the 4 roads into Bakhmut were now within firing distance of the Russian artillery, leaving the Ukrainians exclusively reliant on the O0506 and the dirt roads nearby. At this point, Wagner began a 3-pronged attack, advancing not just in Bakhmut itself, but also along the fields and towns to the north and south of the O0506. The plan here was to presumably encircle the Ukrainians in Bakhmut itself, or at least perform a pincer movement to cut off the O0506. By the end of April, Wagner had advanced a couple of kilometres to the north and south of Bakhmut, forming a sort of U-shape around the westernmost part of the town, still defended by the Ukrainians. Then, at the beginning of May, Wagner's advance stalled, sparking a furious war of words between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin published a video on Wagner's Grey Zone Telegram channel, warning that unless Wagner get more ammunition, they would have to fully withdraw from Bakhmut, and implicitly accusing Shoigu of lying to the Russian public. And another video in front of a whole load of Wagner KIA where he called Shoigu a whole load of expletives and again threatened to withdraw from Bakhmut. Again, it looks like this ammunition never arrived, which is probably one of the reasons that, last week, the Ukrainians began recapturing territory to the north and south of Bakhmut. At time of writing, it looks like the Ukrainians have basically pushed the Russians back to the water reservoirs around Berkivka in the north, and there are reports that the Ukrainians have reached Klishchivka in the south. Now, it's important not to overstate these gains. Most of the territory recaptured is either fields or forest, and it'll be significantly harder for the Ukrainians to retake urban territories like Klishchivka. It's also worth mentioning that the Ukrainians have been unable to make similar gains in Bakhmut itself, and as of Monday afternoon, there were actually reports that Wagner had pushed the Ukrainians to the very outskirts of the town. Although this isn't really that surprising, given that they've clearly decided to focus on the flanks. Nonetheless, it's still bad news for the Russians for a few reasons. For starters, if the Ukrainians can cut off the flanks around Bakhmut, then this will prevent the Russians from making further gains out of Bakhmut. Second, while Prigozhin and Russian military bloggers have claimed that this is the beginning of Ukraine's much-anticipated offensive, Zelensky explicitly said that Ukraine's counter-offensive was being delayed until more Western weapons arrived. If what Zelensky said is true, and not just a bluff, then things are only going to get worse when the counter-offensive starts in full force. But perhaps the main reason this is terrible for the Russians is that it's exposed poor morale in the Russian army and exacerbated divisions between Wagner and the Kremlin. On May the 9th, when the Ukrainians first started making gains along the southern flank, Prigozhin released a furious video accusing the Russian army's 72nd Brigade and Gazprom PMC of fleeing, leaving 500 Wagner troops to die. Since then, Prigozhin has been releasing angrier and angrier videos. A few days later, he again accused the Russian Ministry of Defense of lying and penned a public letter asking Shoigu to visit Bakhmut. Prigozhin even recorded a voice message where he claimed that Wagner was, quote, using their ammunition to stop the fleeing servicemen of the Russian army, apparently implying that Wagner had been shooting at other Russian troops, and described the so-called special military operation as a, quote, stupid war. Perhaps most astonishingly, he released a video where he seemed to implicitly describe Putin as an asshole, and released a poll on his Telegram channel asking who his followers would vote for as president of Russia, Putin or Prigozhin. In the past, Prigozhin has refrained from attacking Putin, directing his ire instead at Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov. The fact that he's now having a go at Putin suggests that relations between Wagner and the Kremlin are now at an all-time low. Now, it's of course worth saying that this could all be some clever psychological operation to encourage the Ukrainians into overextending themselves. But the fact that the Ukrainians are genuinely making gains around Bakhmut suggests that Wagner is genuinely struggling for ammo, and that there were real divisions between Wagner and the Kremlin. A few weeks ago, we were invited to Downing Street, where we were briefed on the government's anti-fraud plan. As part of this, we found out that more younger people have fallen victim to online scams than over 35s. And as our analytics frequently tell us, our audience skews younger, which means that you're likely in this age bracket. So if you want to protect yourself online, you should try NordVPN. NordVPN has a bunch of tools that keep you safe. First, they have a feature called Threat Protection, which protects you from malware, trackers, malicious ads, and phishing scams. But that's not all. NordVPN also has dark web monitoring services, which, even if you somehow do fall victim to online fraud or scams, notifies you if your details end up online, so you can promptly change your passwords and keep yourself protected. And what's more, if technology isn't really your thing, don't worry. NordVPN offers 24/7 customer support and even a 30-day money-back guarantee for all users. So check out our link in the description to get your discount on their 2-year plan, plus 4 extra months on top of that. Thanks for your support.